Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Brian Fonseca. I'm director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. And I'm absolutely delighted to host a conversation with some premier intellectual minds on the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Let me make some quick admin remarks before I lay out the plan of the day and introduce our speakers and then begin conversation. So just briefly, for those joining, we do have simultaneous translation. So if you look at the tab at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a translation tab in which you can navigate between English and Spanish. Some of our speakers will present in Spanish. And so if you want to hear this webcast in English, you must have the English tab clicked, or else it'll be silent when the Spanish, when the presenter presents in Spanish. So that's first, simultaneous translation. Make sure you click the tab one or the other. In the spirit of that, I'd like to ask our speakers to make sure that they, they speak at a rate and speed that is easy for our interpreters to navigate between Spanish and English, so that we don't miss anything meaningful that you say and contribute to the discussion. Finally, I want to just make sure our audience knows that we're going to have significant time to field questions from you and weave them into the conversation. So there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen as well. So as the conversation is ongoing and you see opportunities to inject a question, please feel free to list it in the Q&A tab, and I'll do my best to weave it into the discussion. I'll serve as the moderator and MC for this afternoon's discussion. And so again, thank you all for being here. Here's the format. I'm going to provide some very brief introductions to our speakers. Bios should be circulating. And so each of our speakers commands a much longer introduction than I'm going to provide today. I'm going to do so for brevity reasons so that we can get to the discussion. After I make introductions, I'm going to toss some questions out for our speakers to reflect on and provide 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks addressing those broad questions and themes. Then I'll drive a conversation with some questions that I have that I'm gonna build into the discussion. And then probably around 3:15 to 3:30 or so, I'll begin to weave questions in from the audience. And so with that, let me introduce our speakers. First, a very good friend, mentor, and rock star professor at FIU, Dr. Eduardo Gemara. He's a tenured full professor of political science in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at FIU. He's been at FIU since 1986, where he's also directed the Latin American and Caribbean Center from 1994 to 2007. As director of LAC, Gamarra was involved in research and public policy issues, academic exchanges, fundraising, and other multiple activities in most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. He has extreme intimate understanding and knowledge of the crisis in Venezuela, in the broader geopolitical context and the US relations with the region. And so again, his most recent publication, famed publication, who I happen to be his co-editor in, is on culture and national security in the Americas, which actually includes a brilliant chapter by our colleague, Harold Trinkunis. And so, Dr. Gemara, thanks so much for being here and being a friend and mentor. I have to go on record of saying that. I would feel bad if I didn't, so thank you. Next, we have Susannah Raffali. She'll be joining us momentarily, but she's a Venezuelan nutritionist and activist who has received a number of honors, including being nominated among the 100 Inspiring Women by BBC in 2020 for her work in alleviating hunger in Venezuela, and in particular during the coronavirus pandemic. In 2016, Susannah designed a tool that revealed details behind the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela at the request of CARITAS de Venezuela. This monitoring system, also known as SAMAN, is one of a few sources of intelligence of the emergency that helps us understand, the depths of the crisis ongoing in Venezuela today. Next, we have Diana Vegas Castro, born in Venezuela with a long history of 3 decades in community-based participation and in the NGO world, a sociologist with specialization in social management, with tremendous expertise in designing, executing, evaluating, inventing, and learning from working with people and those that are in most need. She's been the founder and co-founder of local, regional, and national organizations centered on social welfare. Diana has been a member of several boards in the public sector and in civil society. She currently occupies management positions in 2 national networks of social organizations of high profile. She's vice chair of Senejeria and chairperson of the Grupo Social CESAP, and acts as the alternative executive committee of the Latin American Association of Promotion Organizations. So welcome, Diana. Another intellectual that needs no introduction, Geoff Ramsey, who has been with WOLA for some time. He is director for Venezuela and coordinates WOLA's program research and advocacy in Washington. He is a leading expert on Venezuela's political crisis and has traveled regularly to the country since 2004. We've had the honor of hosting Geoff at FIU in the past as well. And so we're really pleased to have Geoff joining us today. Finally, Feliciano Reyna, founder and executive president for Acción, Solidaria, an HIV/AIDS service organization created in 1995. Since 2006, Feliciano has served as coordinator for relief efforts through organizations, the Humanitarian Action Program, which is focused on the complex humanitarian emergency affecting Venezuela. In addition to Acción Solidaria, Reyna has founded a number of other human rights organizations. He is a board member of the International Center for Nonprofit Law and a board member of the Johannesburg-based Global Alliance for Citizen Participation. He has received the Human Rights Award from the Center for Peace and Human Rights at Universidad Central and the Canadian Embassy in Venezuela in 2010. Feliciano, welcome and thanks so much for being with us today. And so that's our lineup of brilliant speakers. I'm really excited to delve into the conversation. And so I'm going to start off by asking our speakers to provide some opening comments, 5 to 7 minutes, addressing one or more of the following questions. The first is why this humanitarian tragedy needs to be addressed so urgently. Detail some of the facts and figures that show the severity of the situation in Venezuela. And then finally, discuss potential ways to address the crisis and how the international community and individuals can help. And so those are the 3 themes I'd like our speakers to tackle during this sort of opening dialogue. And I'd like to start with Eduardo, and then following Eduardo will be Diana, Geoff, Feliciano, and Susannah will join us by then. So with that, Dr. Gamarra, can I kick it over to you to start us off?
Yes, Brian, of course. And let me caution you that I'm, as you know, I'm convalescent right now. I still have a bout in my chest, and so I may lose my voice at any moment. So please forgive me for the rudeness of coughing when I have to, and especially in trying to answer such difficult questions that you have posed before us. And also, I feel a little handicapped, especially because the bulk of the information that we're going to be receiving is coming from our colleagues in Venezuela, who have a wealth of information to share with us about the situation there. So let me begin very briefly as I move forward. First, let me say that the crisis in Venezuela is a crisis that is not caused by a war, by a natural disaster, or by anything that what might be considered, so extraordinarily impossible to address. But the situation in Venezuela is really the crisis of decades of economic and political mismanagement, above all. That the humanitarian crisis in particular that the country is facing today, with the somewhere between 5 and 8 million Venezuelans out of the country, has been seen in different ways. One, of course, as the product of just the last few years, the product, in fact, of sanctions on the regime. But I'd like to stress that here what we have is a combination of factors, right? This long time mismanagement of Venezuela that might even go beyond or before the coming to power of Hugo Chavez in the late 1990s. And this mismanagement, of course, coupled with corruption and and the attempt at constructing an authoritarian project has largely led to the preconditions that precipitated this humanitarian crisis that has not seen parallels in Latin America. We'll learn the figures in just a few moments. So in terms of the magnitude of the crisis, there is no other crisis like this in the history of Latin America that has thrust that many people both into poverty and into exile, and of course into just simply that exodus that we have. Most recent data that comes from Venezuelan sources is that 94.5 people in Venezuela, 95.5% of people in Venezuela live in poverty. Quite surprising for a country that still possesses the world's largest resources in terms of oil. So, given those circumstances, then what is it that can be done, or where is it that this might head? We are, of course, in the immediate few days before an election that I won't go into all of the nuances regarding what has led up to this election, but let us say that this is an election that in some measure, right, has been seen as a way out of the at least the current political predicament. I think there's a little bit of room for optimism, but there's probably greater room for pessimism. And the most likely outcome will be a continuation of the situation, at least in terms of politics, after the electoral round. At the same time, I think it's important to mention that while politics domestically in Venezuela is important in trying to understand how the country will go forward, it's also important to put this in the context of what we in the United States are doing with respect to Venezuela. And here is, I think, where perhaps the bulk of the discussion might occur. We have had a sanctions regime on Venezuela, beginning with the sanctions imposed by President Bush in 2006, and intensifying in gravity up through the current sanctions that the current Biden administration has continued to impose. I've already laid out that, to me, the crisis is not a result of the sanctions. The sanctions add to the depth of the humanitarian crisis, but are not the cause of the crisis. But that said, I think that there's a real need now to begin to assess the effectiveness of these measures. Are the measures achieving what they're supposed to achieve? In other words, are they moving Venezuela toward democracy? Are they moving to any resolution of the humanitarian crisis? And I think that it is important for this forum, at least, to begin to address these issues and to perhaps examine the sanctions with a great more care and perhaps with some concern over how these sanctions might continue, yet at the same time be in some measure modified to address the depth of the humanitarian crisis. And finally, let me talk a little bit about the international community. The European Union is involved in monitoring the elections, these coming elections. That's perhaps the first time the international community has to a certain extent begun to open up, let us say, to Venezuela. As good a news as that might be, right? It seems to me that the international community still has no real Venezuelan policy, and especially with regards to the humanitarian crisis that really groups us today. I think much like the United States needs to rethink the impact and severity of these sanctions, I think at the same time, it's also incumbent upon the rest of the international community to examine these humanitarian sanctions with some care and modify them in a way that you can separate the sanctions from the humanitarian component. And by that, I mean that I think that there's a very significant way in which sanctions can continue to address the violations of human rights, the number of different things that the administration in Venezuela has done, while at the same time or simultaneously making sure that those sanctions aren't deepening the humanitarian crisis. So let me end there, Brian. I took a little bit less than I thought, but I think that's my 3 minutes of contribution.
No. More than enough to get us started. And I'll come back and I have some follow-on questions for you when we get to discussion, because I think you said a few things that are quite interesting to kind of, thread the needle on and tease out. And so we'll do that when we get to Q&A. I want to go to Diana for some opening comments. And so Diana, the floor is yours.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, voy a atreverme a hablar más bien en español porque es de donde siento toda esta situación, así que me voy a poder expresar mucho mejor en español, pero los entiendo perfectamente también en inglés. Bueno, como decía el doctor Gamarra, efectivamente vivimos una emergencia humanitaria sin precedentes en el país, sin precedentes en el continente, profunda, omnipresente, sostenida, negada, desatendida y agravándose permanentemente. En realidad es la superposición de varias crisis gravísimas, social, económica, sanitaria, política, moral, un quiebre y una fragmentación del Estado, el desmoronamiento de la economía formal, violencias, desigualdades sociales y pobreza. Todo ello realmente socavó la capacidad del país para responder de forma oportuna y proporcionada a esa magnitud de crisis que tenemos. La precariedad, la orfandad y el abandono y la pérdida de poder es la nueva normalidad. Vivimos unas paradojas tremendas porque somos un país petrolero, productor de petróleo, sin gasolina. Tenemos grandes reservorios de agua dulce. Aparentemente ocupamos el 10º lugar. Sin embargo, no hay agua suficiente ni segura para el consumo. Tenemos una red hidroeléctrica muy amplia, es la 4ª en el mundo y la 1ª en América Latina, pero la ciudadanía no tiene luz. Tenemos grandes reservas de gas y sin embargo no hay gas doméstico. El Producto Interno Bruto hoy es equivalente al que teníamos hace 47 años y va en descenso. Tenemos 7 años en recesión. La erosión del valor de la moneda es algo impresionante. Hemos perdido 14 ceros a la moneda en 14 años. Y todo esto pues ha supuesto esta economía negra. Tenemos una economía en bolívares y una economía en dólares, y eso supone, por supuesto, una enorme desigualdad. Las brechas de desigualdad han aumentado de forma apreciable. Venezuela, bueno, es el país con mayor inflación en el planeta. Se han cerrado 370.000 empresas en 20 años. Se habla de un industricidio. Tenemos esta situación de la migración de Venezuela, que es el mayor éxodo que ha ocurrido en América Latina y el Caribe en toda la historia moderna. ha supuesto, las cifras recientes hablan de un 20% de personas que han emigrado de Venezuela. El 20% de la población. Es que realmente es una cifra espeluznante. Ha habido una disminución de la esperanza de vida, por supuesto el retraso del crecimiento en los niños, se ha deformado la pirámide poblacional, hemos perdido la base del bono demográfico porque la población envejeció, pero esto ha ocurrido en un lapso de 3-4 años, entonces es sumamente, digamos, voraz todo este cambio que estamos atravesando. A ver, un tercio de la población se encuentra en situación de inseguridad alimentaria moderada, severa, esos son datos del Programa Mundial de Alimentos. Digamos, todo el tema del problema que hay en nutrición lo va a abordar seguramente Susannah Raffali ahora más tarde. Pero ustedes se preguntaban, digamos, en la convocatoria, si es que realmente es urgente la atención a esta crisis. E indudablemente es urgente precisamente porque ha habido un desgaste de los medios de vida gigantesco. Entonces, digamos, la posibilidad que tiene el venezolano promedio de afrontar la crisis está verdaderamente fuera de sus manos porque ha vendido sus medios de vida, ha tenido que venderlos, entonces tampoco hay esos resortes que permitan salir de la crisis. Además, bueno, nos encontramos frente a una criminalización de la sociedad civil que es sumamente complicada porque la sociedad civil organizada en Venezuela está justamente cumpliendo un papel decisivo en lo que tiene que ver con la respuesta humanitaria. Así que bueno, creo que el panorama no pinta bien, sin embargo también hay cosas que están ocurriendo que son sumamente valiosas, importantes que las podamos ver más adelante. Cambio.
Thank you for that, Diana. Geoff, I want to ask you to provide your thoughts now.
Excellent. Well, several of the panelists have already mentioned a few of the points that I wanted to highlight here. I'll just emphasize that, yes, Venezuela's crisis began far before the implementation of the first sectoral sanctions in 2017, and it has its roots in years of mismanagement and corruption. Presenting an accurate snapshot of the crisis is really difficult because Venezuelan authorities have failed to publish relevant data for years and actually retaliate against those who've done so. So in that context, the best data actually comes from NGOs and UN agencies, and even that sometimes can be difficult. Diana mentioned that the UN World Food Program estimates that roughly 1 out of 3 Venezuelans is food insecure and in need of assistance, but that assessment was done in 2019. And so the number is actually likely higher. There's a great platform that has been launched by several national Venezuelan humanitarian organizations called Venezuela, which I'm sure Feliciano will talk more about, and I'll let him do that. But I just want to highlight, sort of, just throw a couple of numbers out there, which, you know, according to this platform, you have 37% of Venezuelans who suffer from chronic health conditions lack access to medicine or treatment. We're talking about a health system that's in complete shambles. I mean, across the country, you have children and adults in critical condition that are, you know, trying to find alternatives to a broken down health system. You know, the national dialysis program is in shambles. The organ transplant system is not operational. So, you know, we're talking about a deep and complex humanitarian emergency. And all of this, of course, is happening in a broader political crisis where you have a government that doesn't respect the right of its people to elect their leaders. So you have a de facto government that essentially controls the territory, or controls enough of it anyway, but faces significant budget shortfalls due to sanctions, and doesn't mind prioritizing its own needs over the needs of the population. So passing on the costs of its current lack of access to funds onto the broader population. And then you have an opposition, which is recognized by many countries as a legitimate government and actually has access to Venezuelan funds that have been frozen abroad. So we've seen this dynamic where you have one party that controls the territory and another that has access to funds. And in that context, we've actually seen some pretty interesting efforts to get to humanitarian agreements, to get to some kind of partial accords that can address the urgent needs of the Venezuelan people on the ground, and potentially even create social capital and momentum towards urgently needed political agreements that can restore the country's democratic institutions. And I just want to mention two of these because I think they're important and relevant to where we are today. The first was this 2020 agreement between the opposition and the Maduro regime that created this channel that was brokered through the Pan American Health Organization, by which the opposition would provide for protective equipment, so biosafety glasses, N95 masks, surgical masks and gloves, etc., for health workers, right? And they would also provide antigen tests, COVID tests. This was, the middle of last year. Cases were rising sharply, and this was an important opportunity to address this crisis. And sort of break the political stalemate as well. Unfortunately, there were some concerns about the allocation of the antigen tests. A lot of them seem to have been placed in health centers outside of populated areas and in government-controlled laboratories that are in areas where and in places where there aren't regular hours and aren't there wasn't an emphasis on massive testing. But it is true that the protective equipment, so the masks, the gowns, the glasses, 1.2 tons of oxygen masks and concentrators, that was actually successfully distributed across 18 health institutions in 14 prioritized states, with the oversight of UN agencies on the ground. That also laid the groundwork for a February 2021 agreement that created this Mesa Técnica Nacional de Vacunación, this national vaccination roundtable. Essentially, this was a framework in which the opposition agreed to use frozen funds to pay debts to COVAX to allow Venezuela to access COVID vaccines earlier in this year. There were negotiations from February till about May, but unfortunately the government in June made its own payment unilaterally to COVAX, and in September the first COVAX vaccines came. So that agreement essentially was sidelined by the government. They've gone ahead and found the means to make their payments to bring in vaccines through COVAX and directly from China and Russia. And you have a situation now where you have about 32% of the country that has both COVID-19 vaccine doses and an additional 16% that has their first dose. That brings us to the current moment where you have negotiations that are currently suspended, but in August, when the parties met in Mexico, the government and the opposition signed a memorandum of understanding to create yet another mechanism to try to address the humanitarian emergency on the ground. They created the Mesa de Atención Social, for the social attention table. And in theory, it's a framework through which the opposition could bring in frozen funds, and the government would, with the oversight of UN agencies and others, commit to using it to get its health system up and running, to address urgent needs in terms of education and other social priorities. I just want to mention all of that because I think, after the regional elections on Sunday, I think there's a chance that we could see the Mexico negotiations resumed. And I think this really should be the priority of the international community, is getting some kind of progress in the implementation of this social attention roundtable. I think if we don't, I think it could spell doom for the negotiations process in general. And I think it's a missed opportunity to address the needs of the Venezuelan people. But for all of that to happen, we need the United States involved. The United States is a key player. It has leverage through sanctions, through recognition. It's a major player. And I'm a little concerned that Venezuela seems to have fallen off of the priority list. We haven't seen a special representative named by this administration. We see sort of Venezuela sort of falling off of the top priorities as other things come up in the hemisphere. So I'm just a little concerned that we're not seeing the level of prioritization of this issue as I'd like to see it. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Geoff. Feliciano, I want to turn to you. And before you take over, I just wanted to let our audience know that you had the opportunity to testify before the U.S. Congress earlier this year. I had the honor of serving on that in that hearing with you. And so, again, delighted to have you here sharing some of those reflections with us again.
Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you for organizing this meeting today. I think, every time that I see that having the risk of having the Venezuelan situation sort of fall off the attention of the international community, I really appreciate these opportunities. I'd like to start, and usually do, by saying that the first ones who alerted to the fact that Venezuela was walking into a context of a humanitarian emergency were Venezuelan human rights organizations. We had been documenting the situation for years, bringing reports to the Inter-American Commission, to the attention of the Human Rights Council, to special rapporteurs. And when we presented in between 2015 and 16, some reports, given that Venezuela was sort of updating its reports to the Human Rights Commission, to treaty bodies, it was clear then in all of these documents prepared by organizations that we were moving from violations of rights or effects on human rights as well in general, and the next specific situations, to one of a great dimension in terms of the damage caused to the population, that it was now of a different nature, whatever was affecting us. When we put them all together, it was clear that it was a dismantling of the institutions that would protect the population, that would guarantee the rule of law and access to an independent judiciary. Corruption was clearly, by that time, 2015, again 16, had become already a major problem, and it had been documented as well by Transparency Venezuela and Transparency International. And then we saw how, the human rights crisis and, again, the lack of protection led to then, other areas being affected, mainly as inevitable effects of consequences of the humanitarian nature of the situation, then in regards to access to food, access to health services, access to education as well. And then, of course, the one that sort of called most of the international attention, which was the migration and refugee crisis. So it is clear for us that the nature, and I think Dr. Gamarra said it very well. I mean, this wasn't produced by, a type of war or internal conflict of those types or a natural disaster. It was a man-made humanitarian emergency that requires, I mean, it has brought us to, a situation. I'm going to mention some numbers. Geoff referred to this platform of information. I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but it is clear now that we have some urgent issues to take care of immediately. There are millions of Venezuelans affected. Diana was also expressing some of those situations. And at the same time, we certainly have to all work towards those kinds of, commitments, negotiations, dialogue that would solve more of the structural problems that have to do with institutional capacities, to rebuilding, also, again, infrastructure, and that will unfortunately take time. So it is absolutely essential that we take care of issues that are affecting the population today. Hume Venezuela, I'm going to write in the chat in a moment how you can access it. It's an effort by over 100 organizations, and the results are being recorded from information on the ground, organizations in 16 states in the country, as well as the capital area, and given different sources of information, including some interviews with over 4,000, it's almost 5,000 people, involving families. Then we have reached, these numbers that are, again, they show the direness of the situation. And as well, we have the reports of the national survey done by the Catholic University. But in multidimensional poverty, it's over 20 million people. And those who are reporting constant, interruptions of power is over 21 million people. And this affects, imagine, even that with the pandemic, students, for example, having already problems of access to, Wi-Fi connectivity and so on, as well having this lack of electricity, not having the possibilities of water, running at homes and so on. Those who lack public transportation, this is affecting teachers, for example, in the low-income areas. It's over 19 million people. The majority of our population still uses public transportation. I mean, you can even see the metro system sometimes running, one of the trains with the doors open. I mean, this is how bad maintenance is. People who are not receiving their cooking gas canisters, it's about 16 million. So we're already recording over 5 million people using firewood to cook, which also is causing other types of problems. And the last one I'm going to mention, it's a lot of information, and I encourage you to look at it. It's that in these interviews, people with the intention of migrating, and this is, again, it's a forced migration, is over 8 million people. So beyond what Diana was saying, over 20% of our population, we may see larger numbers still of people migrating forcefully from Venezuela, and then also having the consequences on the road. It's trafficking, it's forced recruitment, and other types of conditions that are really, really serious and create huge problems for those who really, again, are forced to migrate. So in regards to, some of the things that we believe can be done, and this will be very quickly, Brian, but it's part of your question. One thing is that, we cannot deny at all the types of situations that have been provoked by the government's conduct in terms of human rights. As we all know, we're going into the next phase of investigations at the International Criminal Court. That means that there are reasons to believe that there have been crimes against humanity committed here, and that those responsible will have to face justice. Also, the fact-finding mission of the Human Rights Council has already been documenting these situations, also reached the same conclusion in terms of the reasons to believe that there have been these types of crimes, besides, again, other types of human rights violations. But even with that in mind, the situation is so dire, the effects on the Venezuelan population is such, and it affects so many million people that we need engagement no matter what. So even recognizing the nature of those who are holding power nowadays, the only way in which we can probably walk out of this extremely dire situation is by having these types of mechanisms, such as the negotiations in Mexico, or some talks that have been taking place in Venezuela, of which we have been part of. So, I mean, we, again, recognizing the nature of what we have in front, the risks of civil society organizations, our own was raided. 8 members of my staff were arrested last year arbitrarily. Even with that, we believe absolutely that it is necessary to have that kind of engagement. And I will end with the sanctions issue, not very deeply, but we also believe, as Professor Gamarra was saying, there must be a revision of the sanctions regime. Perhaps not all the individual sanctions have a purpose, but the general sectorial, and particularly in our case, we have been advocating, as you know, Brian, from that hearing, for the lifting, immediate lifting of the sanctions regarding diesel for oil swaps, because what they're doing is hurting food producers in the fields, small producers, transportation of foodstuffs, transportation of people, of those teachers who have to go to work, and also preventing, you know, the feeding of some power plants that are part of, for example, the small clinics here and there around the country. So even though one can tie the lifting of sanctions to certain sort of trade-offs, in this regard, we're absolutely calling for an immediate lift of that type of sanction. Thank you.
Thanks, Feliciano. And definitely in the Q&A, I want to tease out a little bit more of that distinction between targeted and sectoral sanctions. I think right now they're all under the same umbrella, sort of inspiring American foreign policy towards Venezuela, but they're having very different effects in terms of the broader crisis and the broader geopolitical landscape as well. And so I appreciate your thoughtful comments and look forward to delving more in the Q&A. So I want to turn the floor over now to Susannah. And Susannah, welcome again. And I turn the floor over to you for some opening remarks.
Gracias, voy a necesitar el aporte, el apoyo de la intérprete. Y les ofrezco mis disculpas por entrar tarde, pero no pude manejar una coincidencia de reuniones con la universidad. Voy a compartir pantalla con algunos indicadores. Listo. Entonces, rápidamente, cuando es el caso de compartir, de analizar la escala de una emergencia humanitaria, uno habla justamente de la cantidad de personas afectadas, de si el daño que está ocurriendo pone a estas personas al filo de la vida, la intensidad del daño y el pronóstico y los factores agravantes de esto, ¿no? En términos según esos criterios, es que uno se maneja con los diferentes estadios de las situaciones humanitarias para clasificarlas de crisis, de emergencia o de catástrofes. Y yo lo dejo una primera lámina conceptual a pesar del poco tiempo, porque es lo que más usamos en mi sector, sobre todo en términos de nutrición y seguridad alimentaria. Para compartir algunas figuras, algunos datos e imágenes, tanto generadas al interno del país como afuera. Esta es el mapa del Programa Mundial de Alimentos, de su encuesta nacional de seguridad alimentaria, en la que estamos conscientes de que más de un tercio de la población está manejando necesidades de alimentación extremas. Si uno ve esa encuesta presentada en el tablero del Programa Mundial de Alimentos, es cuando entiende la gravedad de esto, porque no se trata solo de consumo de alimentos. La inseguridad alimentaria se define por el uso de estrategias de medios de vida para llegar hasta ahí. Entonces la lámina es extraordinariamente clara en mencionar que solo el 8% de los venezolanos gozan de seguridad alimentaria en términos de tener un buen consumo de alimentos sin que sacrifiquen por ello gran cantidad de sus medios de vida. Sin embargo, la lámina también es extraordinariamente elocuente en mostrar que el 82% entonces de la población, que es la suma de estas tres ventanas, el 82% de la población de Venezuela tiene un consumo alimentario apenas suficiente y que para llegar a esto, el 60% de los hogares, para llegar a ese consumo mínimo de alimentos, ha agotado ya su base de recursos de medios de vida y pone en marcha estrategias de sobrevivencia que son muy inseguras y que no se pueden sostener en el tiempo. Y eso es lo que hace la combinación de la gravedad de los indicadores. Visto esto en la escala de valoración de las crisis alimentarias del planeta, el IPC, uno puede decir entonces que tenemos algunos rasgos en la situación alimentaria que son consistentes con una emergencia humanitaria franca. Básicamente la proporción de niños en desnutrición aguda, el bajísimo consumo de alimentos y de diversidad de la dieta y el agotamiento de los medios de vida. Entonces yo diría que en términos de seguridad alimentaria estamos aún manejándonos en una situación de emergencia alimentaria con algunos rasgos en los últimos 2 años que parecieran irse más hacia el lado de la crisis porque mejoró la oferta alimentaria y la producción de alimentos en el país, pero la población ya no tiene medios de vida para tener acceso a ellos. Sin embargo, esa leve mejoría se ve opacada por la activación de los factores agravantes, básicamente el colapso de los servicios públicos, la migración masiva no estacional y la pérdida absoluta del Estado de Derecho, básicamente del control del gobierno sobre, del control del Estado sobre el territorio. En términos de nutrición, rápidamente, antes de la pandemia, estábamos manejando cifras de desnutrición aguda, grave, en niños menores de 5 años, casi consistentes con el umbral de crisis humanitaria, que es la línea amarilla. Después de la pandemia, esto subió a 17.3, claramente muy por encima del umbral de una emergencia de salud pública y volvió a disminuir, ahora mismo está sobre un 12%, nuevamente nos alegramos de que esté mejorando, pero se mantienen niveles más altos de prepandemia y por encima de los umbrales consistentes con una crisis humanitaria. Esta es del 2016, pero en términos de cifras oficiales es lo último que tenemos. Yo con las próximas 2 láminas lo que quiero es ilustrarles que la emergencia no solamente la define, que en 2016 se hubieran muerto 11.000 niños en Venezuela antes de su primer cumpleaños, sino la velocidad con la que llegamos ahí. Es esta pendiente, en el caso de las barras negras, acelerada, sobre todo desde el 2012, rápidamente hasta aquí, en el 2016, o en el términos de mortalidad materna, la línea del histograma, cómo aumentamos del 2012 hasta el 2016, es esta velocidad del deterioro lo que haría catalogar esto como una franca emergencia humanitaria, porque si esta es la evolución con esta rapidez, si no se ataja esto, los pronósticos son muy malos. Esto de la velocidad, usar la velocidad del deterioro como un sinónimo de emergencia, sucede también en malaria. Esto es el subidón en malaria desde el año 2010. Miren la escalada en términos de malaria. Entonces no es que sea que 240.000 casos sean la emergencia, que lo es que es la velocidad con la que llegamos ahí lo que convierte esto en términos de salud pública en una emergencia de impostergable urgencia. ¿Cómo nos ven desde afuera? Termino con 2 láminas. Yo simplemente, esto es el último reporte de situación de la Oficina de Coordinación de Asuntos Humanitarios de Naciones Unidas, la OCHA. Lo expongo solamente por decir que en cualquier país en el que se active la OCHA es inequívoco que hay una emergencia humanitaria a gran escala. A esto se suma que aparezca Venezuela por primera vez en el Global Humanitarian Overview desde el 2019. No hay emergencias sencillas que aparezcan en el panorama de emergencias humanitarias del planeta. Esto es una emergencia a gran escala que ya ocupa un lugar en estas graduaciones. En términos de seguridad alimentaria, estamos entre las 10 peores crisis alimentarias del planeta, en el lugar número 4, es decir, con 6 países que están mejor que nosotros, y lamentablemente dentro de estas 10 estamos como países latinoamericanos compartiendo el lugar con Haití, pero Haití está en esta graduación por el agotamiento de sus recursos naturales, por la desertificación y la deforestación en ese país, mientras que nosotros estamos por decisiones políticas que se han tomado o se han dejado de tomar, y el resto de países por conflictos armados. Luego el portal ACAPS, que es el portal más riguroso de evaluación de las crisis humanitarias del planeta. Nuevamente ACAPS nos ubica junto con Guatemala y Colombia entre las crisis humanitarias más severas en estos momentos, y todos sabemos que la de Colombia está con el color más severo, no por su conflicto armado y sus necesidades humanitarias que han venido mejorando extraordinariamente, sino por la afluencia de migrantes venezolanos. Así que como país estamos generando las peores 2 crisis humanitarias de América del Sur en los peores grados de severidad. Con esta lámina termino. Yo pienso que en este punto Venezuela carga con el peso de primero de su base de pobreza crónica, la barra roja, pero luego con el peso de las necesidades humanitarias de esta emergencia humanitaria compleja, a la que se sumó los efectos tan complicados que han generado las sanciones sobre la vida cotidiana de todos nosotros, e incluso sobre las operaciones de las organizaciones humanitarias. A esto se suma la pandemia por COVID-19. Cuando pensábamos que no podíamos estar peor, cuando empezó la pandemia, viene la crisis de retornados que generó la COVID, cuando comienzan a cerrar las economías en los países de acogida. Y a esto, ya asfixiados totalmente, se nos sobrepone el fenómeno de la niña, que está ahorita en curso. Así que yo pienso que esta sobreposición de pesos ha conducido a unas necesidades humanitarias a gran escala que nos preocupan enormemente, y esto eran las cifras que quería compartir con ustedes en este momento. Cambio, muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for that overview and the slides. I think it was very, very thoughtful and provides some really good context to the humanitarian situation. So Susannah, thank you so much for those remarks. I want to now sort of go to a series of questions that I want to toss out to our speakers to tease out some of the things I know came up in our introductory comments, but I'd like to go a little deeper on. And so I want to start with Dr. Gemara. And so Dr. Gemara, I have a few questions. I'll throw one out and get your thoughts on it. And then if there's time, I'll come back for a second. But you provided a really, I think, thoughtful overview to the crisis, to the situation going on. And I know that it was brought up, and I think Geoff brought up, the state of political agreements and negotiations ongoing, but a lot of people question whether or not the situation can improve ahead of any type of political agreement or successful negotiations that unfold. And so my question to you is political agreement or a successful negotiation required in order to assuage some of the crisis that's ongoing now? And sort of as a part B, what can we expect of the sanctions that we've talked about, and they've been thrown in quite a bit? And I think that the panel largely sits on the side of questioning whether or not the sanctions regime in place now in American foreign policy is having the effect desired. Can you provide some broad comments to that?
Yes, Brian, thank you. I want to sort of go back and refer to something that I think Feliciano had mentioned, and that is, look, the situation in Venezuela, and as illustrated by all of the speakers, it's frankly, at a point where I think very few of us who've studied Latin America for so long would have ever imagined a country in the region to reach these dire straits. I think especially we would have never thought Venezuela to reach such a situation. And more importantly, I think we also thought at some point that Venezuela, of all countries, because of the resources it had, that were it to undergo a crisis, would be able to overcome it, to come out of it much more readily than other countries in the region. Well, today we know that that's not the case, and today what we see is a situation, again, a crisis that is man-made, a crisis created by political and economic mismanagement. And so the irony of this, of course, is that to resolve the situation, we have to, and I think this is what Feliciano's point is, and it's a very powerful one. That is, we need to, in some measure, engage with those who are the only ones responsible for the situation in Venezuela. That to begin to address the humanitarian crisis, there has to be some kind of involvement with the very people who caused it to begin with. And that, in fact, then calls for the need to push urgently for some kind of a political agreement, even if the political agreement isn't what might be the most desirable. But given those figures that all of our speakers have addressed, it appears to me, at least, that there will be no move forward unless we can get some engagement with those authorities who are, again, and I repeat, the ones that have caused this dramatic situation. That's part one of your question. The second part, Brian, has to do with the sanctions. You know, the sanctions aimed to move the government of Venezuela in the direction of democracy, in the direction of opening up, in the direction of resolving some of these heinous crimes that they've committed over the last 2 decades. But the unintended consequences of the sanctions are the ones that are really, in some measure, the ones that have us today discussing this, because the sanctions are having 2 kinds of effects. On the one hand, they're having an impact on the very people that we're trying to help. And again, Feliciano mentioned some of those consequences, right? And I think that's where we need to really examine how to minimize the impact of these sanctions on the average Venezuelan, which is, who is experiencing those horrible conditions that were just illustrated by Susannah's presentation. That on the one hand, but then there are other unintended consequences that have to be dealt with as well. And this is probably the more difficult ones, because in some measure, the unintended consequences have also been that they have strengthened the position of the government, that in fact, they may have benefited the government rather than punished the government. And I think those need to be also looked at and explored very carefully. So I'm not in favor of lifting the sanctions just willy-nilly, but I do think that we have to have a real conversation about how we can avoid this terrible impact of the unintended consequences of both punishing those we're trying to help and helping those we're trying to punish.
Those are great points. And again, it sort of begs the analysis of differentiating the sectoral from targeted sanctions, right? As a part of a portfolio of sanctions coming from the United States, largely in an effort to move the needle, right, in terms of shaping some behavior, within the regime directly. But again, I appreciate your perspective on the unintended consequences, not just on the humanitarian side, but also the emboldening and the ways that sanctions may continue to not just alienate, but provide some opportunity for the regime directly. And I think you're right. A lot more needs to be, sort of parsed out on that. I want to jump over to Diana and Susannah, and I think both of your presentations were very good. I'd like to tease out a little bit more about, sort of the urgency of the work carried out by organizations that you're affiliated with on the ground in Venezuela, and how that appeals to the international community. So we're debating. I mean, we've hit a few, foreign policy issues, at least from the US perspective already. But in terms of more broadly engaging the international community, what are some opportunities that are there as it relates to assuaging the crisis itself? So Diana, you want to go first and then Susannah?
Sí, yo creo que es importante destacar el papel de la sociedad civil venezolana frente a la crisis, porque, digamos, frente a la desaparición del Estado en muchos ámbitos territoriales, pero también de protección del ciudadano, pues la ciudadanía organizada ha tenido en la práctica que suplantar al Estado, cosa que evidentemente no es su naturaleza, pero vemos a organizaciones que están dedicadas justamente a suplir comida, a dar servicios de salud, a dotar de medicamentos a la población, de insumos médicos, de dar protección a los niños, niñas y adolescentes, a las mujeres que han sido víctimas de violencia, acompañando a las personas que sufren en contención psicosocial. Digamos, ha habido un mundo de acciones de respuesta de la sociedad civil, rehabilitando acueductos, produciendo información, todo esto que hablaba Feliciano de la importancia que hoy día disponemos de un portal que puede suplir en parte el problema gigantesco que tenemos de déficit de información pública. Tenemos años de rezago y en ese sentido poder contar con un portal ha sido efectivamente muy importante también para poder planificar y poder ubicar dónde está la mayor vulnerabilidad, pero indudablemente también la sociedad civil organizada ha documentado y denunciado la violación de derechos humanos, y eso todo ha supuesto también entrar en un ejercicio de la diplomacia humanitaria, en donde justamente se ha buscado visibilizar la crisis, pero también persuadir a la cooperación internacional a que aumente la inversión en Venezuela, porque bueno, sencillamente los datos muestran, estos datos, que todavía son parciales, no son datos oficiales, pero muestran una gravedad creciente de la crisis, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, es una buena noticia saber que la sociedad civil organizada en Venezuela no está paralizada, a pesar de que ha sufrido muchísimo, pero está articulada y está de alguna manera jugando un papel también en el tema de la respuesta, pero también en el tema del liderazgo, en los mecanismos de coordinación dentro de la acción humanitaria del país. Lógicamente que hay un déficit en el cual la interlocución con el sector público no es especialmente fluido, ni especialmente, digamos, eficaz. Sin embargo, no hay duda que especialmente regionales y locales hay mucho más oportunidades de incidencia en asuntos con los organismos oficiales, y eso, pues bueno, de alguna manera coayuda en que la atención a la emergencia sea más, al menos se termine de recibir y se minimice el tema de la politización precisamente de la ayuda, porque es tremendamente peligroso que la ayuda termine siendo utilizada justamente como un mecanismo de acción política, ¿no? Vemos con mucha esperanza cómo la sociedad civil se ha ido, también la diáspora venezolana se ha ido organizando, ha recogido fondos para cooperar, ha logrado también hacer incidencia y visibilizar la crisis. En muchos países de acogida se han creado organizaciones en donde se está protegiendo a los venezolanos que han migrado, y eso también, bueno, nos habla de esa capacidad del venezolano de resistir y de salir adelante frente a las adversidades. Lógicamente que necesitamos muchísimo más ayuda, necesitamos no ser olvidados, que esta crisis no se convierta en una crisis olvidada, y necesitamos de la cooperación internacional, su atención, su cercanía, también apoyando las iniciativas de la sociedad civil organizada, más allá, digamos, de la estructura humanitaria que ha construido Naciones Unidas en el país y las organizaciones internacionales que también han hecho lo suyo, pero al final de toda esta crisis, los que vamos a quedar somos las organizaciones venezolanas. Por tanto, necesitamos poder salir fortalecidos de toda esta crisis, y con eso queremos contar con la cooperación internacional para ello. Cambio.
Thanks, Diana. Susannah.
Sí, voy a compartir pantalla otra vez. Ok, yo les quisiera compartir dónde veo yo el sentido de urgencia de apoyar la respuesta humanitaria del país y de ayudar a mitigar los daños que se están generando. Primero, el primero de estos dos factores que quisiera compartirles es lo insuficiente que ha sido el financiamiento humanitario para el plan humanitario de respuesta. No solamente insuficiente en la cantidad de fondos que se ha podido captar después de los primeros appeals, después de los primeros llamamientos, sino insuficiente de origen en términos de su cálculo. Entonces, a pesar de que las estadísticas de la página del tracking financiero de OCHA en el país muestran que sí, obviamente, a partir del 2018, la captación de fondos humanitarios es creciente e indetenida. Lo cierto es que no hemos podido avanzar más allá de unos 300 millones de dólares. Esta financiación, según la distribución de organismos de cooperación, el 40% está viniendo de la Agencia Norteamericana de Cooperación y el 30% de la Oficina de Cooperación Humanitaria de la Comisión Europea. Pero otra cosa en la que se ha mejorado mucho es que han aumentado también aportaciones individuales de gobiernos por mecanismos bilaterales, mucho de Europa también. Pero volviendo a la insuficiencia de todo esto, este es el último reporte de situación de la respuesta humanitaria publicado en junio del 2021. A junio del 2021, de las 4.5 millones de personas que el Plan Humanitario de Respuesta proyectó alcanzar, solamente se ha alcanzado a 1.9 millones de personas, ¿verdad? Y aquí están los diferentes números de personas que se ha llegado por cada uno de los sectores. Yo les voy a mostrar esto más grande en unas láminas. Según el portal ACAPS, en el 2021 están en necesidades humanitarias en el país 14.803.000 personas. Y el último plan humanitario de respuesta se proyecta llegar a 4.5 millones de estos 14. Es decir, solo al 30%. De estos, a julio del 2021, en el 2021 solo se ha llegado al círculo amarillo, al círculo rojo, que es 1.9 millones. Entonces, lo que les estoy tratando de decir es que de este universo de necesidades humanitarias, lo que se ha proyectado con el Plan Humanitario de Respuesta a alcanzar son solo 4.5 millones, solo 30%, y de estos, dado la poca captación de fondos humanitarios y de activación de proyectos, se está llegando solo a una mínima cantidad. Si yo pongo esto en términos de mi sector, que es el sector de seguridad alimentaria, de los 9 millones de personas en seguridad alimentaria, que es el círculo azul, se proyectó llegar con el HRP, con el Humanitarian Response Plan, solo a 700.000. Y de estas, a junio del 2021, el desempeño del año 2021 al menos es de 166.000 personas. Es decir, solo el 2% de los 9 millones de personas con necesidades inmediatas de asistencia alimentaria se están viendo beneficiados por la ayuda. Y esto es en gran parte a que no se han captado suficientes fondos de la cooperación internacional. Entonces, para mí es inequívoco la urgencia de todo esto. Esto es la distribución de los fondos. La mayor parte de los fondos, el 96% de los fondos ha sido captado por agencias de Naciones Unidas. Solo un 3% ha sido captado por organizaciones nacionales, y esto agrava aún más los porcentajes que les di antes, porque la respuesta dada a través de Naciones Unidas sí que es efectiva y rigurosa, pero lleva implícitos grandes gastos burocráticos y operativos. Yo les quería mencionar el otro factor de urgencia que yo veo en este momento, es no las tenía aquí, es el de las estrategias de sobrevivencia que se están poniendo en marcha. Aquí lo tengo. ¿Por qué es urgente esto? Esto es una gráfica universal en la que se han estudiado las estrategias de sobrevivencia que las personas ponen en marcha cuando se quedan sin tener con qué comer. Las que están en este principio del espectro las activamos en el 2017, estas las activamos en el 2018, la venta de enseres domésticos, desmembrarnos como familia para poder consumir lo que necesitamos. Y ya en el 2021 se activan las más intensas aquí del color intenso, las últimas hasta el agotamiento y el colapso, que es la liquidación total de los bienes familiares, el acudir a estrategias de sobrevivencia ilegales o inseguras, o el definitivamente migrar como familia. Entonces, ¿a qué me refiero yo? Que ya pasamos, que ya no hay tiempo de más, que la urgencia es que se acabó el tiempo, que pasamos desde el 2014-15 del estado de privación al desgaste de nuestros medios de vida para aguantar lo que nos está pasando, y que esa erosión persistente nos ha llevado a una situación de destitución absoluta de la base de recursos familiares, que nos pone ante dos situaciones: si esto se agrava o si no se recibe la suficiente ayuda. A la corrupción misma y a la descomposición de la unidad familiar venezolana para poder aguantar esto, a la muerte o a la migración, pero ya se nos acabaron las reservas para aguantar. Entonces yo pienso que en estos dos factores, en la poca financiación que se ha recibido y el poco alcance que tiene la respuesta ahorita con respecto al universo de personas en necesidad, y el que estamos ya con unas familias venezolanas al límite de sus medios de vida, después del cual solo les queda morir, migrar o descomponerse en estrategias muy ilegales e inseguras, reside la urgencia de seguir manteniendo visible la emergencia humanitaria en Venezuela, y manteniendo visible la necesidad urgente de captar más fondos de financiación. ¿Qué hemos hecho frente a eso como organizaciones? Ya Diana lo mencionó, no me voy a detener más allí, pero yo quiero mencionar al menos 3 más que son muy importantes. Hemos participado en las conferencias de donantes con información rigurosa, a las que no se nos ha invitado. Lamentablemente a muchas de ellas no se nos ha invitado como organizaciones nacionales. Hemos participado en todos los mecanismos de defensa de los derechos humanos nacionales e internacionales, en la CIDH, en las audiencias de CIDH, en el EPU, en todos los mecanismos en los que hemos podido presentar los informes. Se ha mantenido la situación humanitaria visible. Formamos parte del equipo humanitario del país y hemos ayudado a la configuración del plan humanitario de respuesta, y formamos finalmente parte del grupo internacional por la localización de la respuesta humanitaria, y para tratar de toda esta financiación que está llegando se pueda redireccionar para que las organizaciones nacionales de la sociedad civil tengan un mejor papel en todas las respuestas. Gracias, cambio.
Thanks so much for that, Susannah. Diana, Susannah, thank you. I wanna toss a question out to Geoff and Feliciano. Of course, Dr. Gamarra sort of set the stage for us, and Diana and Susannah certainly talked more about the civil society and some of the ways the humanitarian crisis is affecting, the broader Venezuelan population. I want to get your thoughts on potential measures or mechanisms. I know you both are incredibly familiar with American foreign policy, for example, and Susannah pointed out, the pronounced impact that the U.S. has in her sort of composite on Venezuela. And so what are some of the policy provisions or measures or mechanisms that can be done to address the humanitarian crisis? And just sort of elaborating on what was said before, what are some of the things that are needed in order to help alleviate the pressure to the Venezuelan people? Geoff, do you want to go first?
Sure. As Susannah mentioned, the HRP I think has only been about 30% funded. That's the humanitarian response plan for the UN in Venezuela. I think we can do better. I think the U.S. should be leading efforts to contribute to the work of UN agencies and international and domestic humanitarian organizations on the ground. The second is, I think there does need to be a review of existing policy. We've been hearing that it's ongoing, that the administration has been reviewing sanctions policy with no clear conclusions at this point. I think the U.S. needs to take a good look at the leverage that it has and actually use it. I think one thing that worries me is the risk that we could just see protracted stalemate in Venezuela today, where the issue doesn't have an easy quick fix, and so it just falls off the priority list. And I'm kind of afraid that's what's happening right now. Like I mentioned, what have we seen this administration do this year? We've seen a lot of rhetoric in support of the negotiations. We've seen, support for the humanitarian response, but nowhere near the amounts that we need to see. I think if this administration wants to prove that Venezuela is a top priority in its Latin America foreign policy, one way to do that would be to either name a special representative that could coordinate with the Venezuela Affairs Unit in Bogota and would provide someone based in Washington that could oversee all of the different offices in state and treasury that are working on Venezuela. Or another, if a special representative is off the table, might be to name a deputy assistant secretary who could have a sole exclusive focus on Venezuela, like there is for the Northern Triangle in Central America. I mean, to me, it's a little surprising that we haven't seen that happen so far. I think the focus of the policy right now needs to be on advancing some kind of political solution. I think the partial agreements that I've mentioned in my initial statement, I think they offer lessons for future partial agreements, future humanitarian accords that hopefully can come out of the Mexico process if and when it's restarted. But that's going to require political capital, and I think there's a window now where this is still on the priority list for the international community. It's still, this isn't going away. This is still perceived as a crisis that's worth addressing. But my fear is domestically, the closer we get to midterms in this country, that we're going to see an administration that's increasingly or decreasingly risk prone. That's that just decides that it's better left just on autopilot rather than actually exerting political capital on this issue and trying to break the stalemate. So those are sort of the fears that I have, and I hope I'm wrong.
No, I'm afraid you're not. I don't think you're wrong, Geoff, on those. I think those are thoughtful, and again, just sort of echoing what you said. contributing more to the UN humanitarian aid program, appointing some special counsel to help lead the American charge from Washington and coordinate the different agencies in Washington, whether that's a special representative like we see in the past, or the concept of appointing assistant secretary like we have done in Central America. Advancing, if not participating in negotiated solutions. You didn't say participating, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but certainly, advancing and supporting political negotiations is important. Feliciano, before you jump in, I want to ask Geoff as a quick sort of aside, do you see more space? You linked domestic politics in the United States to the prospects of, American foreign policy towards Venezuela. And I think that's an important observation to highlight for a moment. Do you think the midterms in the U.S. next year might change any calculation that the party in power has, or at least the White House has, in terms of its ability to navigate that foreign policy landmine?
Yeah, well, it's no secret that Florida is a key state for both parties in this country, and that has serious implications for U.S. foreign policy across our hemisphere. And so, I do think that there's a risk that the administration is looking at this issue, is hearing from our international partners that this is an opportunity, this is a moment to prioritize the search for a political solution, but is looking domestically at its own incentives ahead of the midterms, and I'm afraid that might be what's causing them to drag their feet.
Thanks, Geoff. That's a good point. Okay, Feliciano, I want to ask you to provide some thoughts on that as well.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to combine two things we've been speaking about. One is the cooperation by the United States through its, through USAID and others, and then the sanctions. One is that, it is important to recognize such cooperation. A good part has been done, for example, via Pan American Health Organization and other large UN institutions, UNICEF and others. But it is true that also part is, going towards strengthening the support for smaller Venezuelan organizations. And I think that's the absolutely right path. There's so many, Diana was mentioning this, there's so many organizations. We all started, again, without any experience whatsoever before, because it was unthinkable that Venezuela would go into, a humanitarian situation. But we've done these sort of adjustments and shifts, in our the organizations to be able to respond as well to humanitarian needs, and that has had support by the U.S. With risks, of course, and this is one area of engagement. If it's possible to have those talks, it would be, I think, possible, hopefully, not to have, funds by US and some of the organizations that have US resources to be criminalized. That's one really important thing. But then this goes now to the sanctions issue. And this is why I call always for the sort of individualization of sanctions. What are the targeted, what are the sectorial, what are the oil, and which are the, again, diesel swaps and so on. Because one issue that is affecting many organizations, particularly the newer ones and the smaller ones, is that due to certain provisions in sanctions, it is basically impossible to open up accounts, for example, and to provide support even for humanitarian programs or for human rights defenders. So, there has been a lot of work being done in this regard, in having talks with Treasury, with banking associations. Geoff and I have been into this for quite a while now, and it makes it extremely difficult. So this is, again, something that calls for engagement, for revision, for possibilities of some institutions to act in regards to easing the way to get these resources to the smaller organizations. Of course, again, PAHO, UNICEF, and so on have no problems. We do. And also our providers. One project we had at a large, I would say, a mother and children's hospital here. Our supplier of medical equipment took 3 months to go through all the, these issues of compliance in order to finally be able to provide for those equipment. So it really complicates things. I have to recognize the TPS. I think it's really, really important. And hopefully with Colombia in the region, it would be ideal to also work in doing something for Venezuelans around the region, providing protection. And these are not economic migrants. These are refugees, people who need protection. And with the example, again, of a TPS and Colombia's also, it would be very important to have these kinds of mechanisms. And I think the US can do a very good job there. Unfortunately, after the talks in Quito, I think 3 years ago, nothing happened. And what we saw were just countries doing, this and that on their own. My last thing, and I know, Brian, that this is in sort of difficult waters. We cannot forget that Venezuela is also part of sometimes of the internal situation. This is in Spain, mostly, and then again Colombia and the US. And I'd love to see if we're able to, again, to be able to carefully look at the situations and the measures and the policies that affect the Venezuelan people. If we can, sort of, again, take the noise or the extra stuff out of them, it will be possible to help the Venezuelan people inside of Venezuela, while we know of all the difficulties and the politics of the internal issues. And I think that in this sense, the Venezuelan community in Florida, for example, could do a lot. We have peers who have left because they had medical issues and so on, and they are concerned. They know what is happening here. So perhaps those conversations, can also happen with them, and hopefully, we'll be able, again, to take the extra stuff and look at the core of issues, particularly thinking about Venezuelans in need. Thank you.
Thanks, Feliciano. And I definitely take your point about trying to disaggregate domestic politics and foreign policy, which seems incredibly difficult to do. But I think therein lies the need for greater precision in terms of the specific policies. The broad brush of sanctions, right, has not been an effective strategy at dislodging Maduro or creating any real space, meaningful space. And instead, what it's done is it's kept actors from engaging in Venezuela that could produce, over the long term, I think, important change. And we talk about sectoral sanctions to begin with. And again, thinking about how the American private sector is limited in its ability to engage on the ground in Venezuela because of sanctions and the repercussions of being slammed with lawsuits or legal action on behalf of the U.S. government when they get home. And so, that's keeping a very important, actor off the playing field in the broader context of engagement, right? And not just thinking about engagement in the context of state to state, but all of the non-state organizations that could have very meaningful dialogue and engagement to help put pressure and produce change over the long term in Venezuela. And I think, again, as we, has been highlighted here, and again, I echo the sanctions in their current form do just that. They keep people, particularly Americans, out of Venezuela that could have meaningful impact on the ground over the long term. I want to do a follow-up, Feliciano, and it has to do with the prospects of delivering humanitarian assistance directly to Venezuelans. The argument that we hear quite a bit, particularly in political circles in the United States, is that supporting or providing humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan people provides an important pressure release valve for the government, and does as much to support the government than it does to alleviate the burden and pressure on Venezuelans. How do we reconcile that going forward? Is that, first and foremost, is that accurate? And then second, how do we reconcile that?
Thank you so much for this question, Brian. I think, first, I usually answer more from an ethical point of view. If you have millions of people suffering, what if it helps somehow the Maduro government, in spite of all the damage that it has created, because it is the originator of such damage. But what if it does, somehow create, or eases the situation here and there? So the very first concern is the people, and if there's something that can and should be done to again preventing them from leaving, as Susana was showing, all the situations and having to get rid of all their livelihoods and so on. That's the main concern. But the second one, Brian, and this has been, I've talked to some, in different sectors. If you wanted to rebuild the medical system nowadays with all the, the lack of infrastructure and the lack of personnel and equipment and so on, I mean, the state in which it is nowadays, you would need an investment of about $5 billion per year. If you wanted to recover the food production system as well, with all of what it means in sort of the chain and distribution and so on, what I have understood from those who know about this is that you would need at least $12 billion. The humanitarian response plan so far is no more than $700 million. Even if it went to 1.5 or 2 billion, what you're doing again is putting in place measures to help the people. There would be no way in which what it would do is a major sort of setting up of the stage for the Venezuelan government to benefit.
So to your point, the introduction of greater aid can be calibrated in a way that it doesn't prop up the regime, but help alleviate the pressure, sort of disaggregate. I mean, that's a difficult thing to reconcile, but I appreciate your thoughts on it, Feliciano. Were you going to say, yeah.
Yeah, just that, again, I mean, much more is needed, Brian, and much more is needed in the region as well. If one looks at the Syrian situation, the response plan for the region is $6 billion. The response plan for the region in regards to Venezuela refugee situation is $1.4 billion. We're so far away, both internally and externally. So there is a lot more that can be done that at the end would help solve issues, again, of the economy, development, security, and of course, putting in the first place the individual and the community issues, which are, again, I would say the first priority. Thank you.
Thanks, Feliciano. I want to ask a question to Dr. Gemara, and then I want to go out to the audience for questions. I have a few questions in the Q&A box, but I encourage the audience, if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A box, and I'll weave them in as soon as I can. But I want to ask Dr. Gemara a question about the broader crisis in the region and the effect that Venezuela's crisis is having on its neighbors. I see a dear friend and colleague joining us or in the audience from Guyana, Jerry Gavea, who is the National Security Advisor for Guyana. And I can't help but think about the security implications that the crisis is having on its neighbors, Colombia, Guyana. And so, Dr. Gemara, can you provide some thoughts about how that crisis or how the crisis in Venezuela is affecting the region more generally?
Yeah, let me try to be brief in answering this, because that calls for for an awful lot of thorough analysis of the broad impact. In fact, that already Feliciano was noting, for example, that the plight of Venezuelans all over the hemisphere is severe, and the responses in each country have largely been triggered by domestic political concerns. So it touches on that issue that the three of you, including Geoff, were talking about, that in each country, Venezuela is not really only a foreign policy issue, but it's very much of a domestic policy issue. And so you have, in electoral processes and in just in general discussions about public policy, whether it's in Chile and Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, et cetera, where the Venezuelan issue has become an extraordinarily significant one. And I think that the response, while there are some very interesting and and very positive responses. The Colombian one might be highlighted with the TPS-like measures that they've taken. But in general, I think that each country is largely driven by these domestic policy concerns, and therefore the reactions have not been, I would say, reactions that ought to be celebrated, especially the increase in xenophobia that we've seen in countries like Peru and in countries like Chile, et cetera, right? The second thing that I think we paid some attention to, but not that much, and that is that, underlying this mass movement of Venezuelans across the hemisphere, down to the south and then back up and into the United States, is something that I think we haven't paid attention to, and that is the organized crime and how significant organized crime is in moving people and taking advantage of the situation of people really from every socioeconomic status in Venezuela. Their entire fortunes are being depleted by paying these organizations to move them across the hemisphere. And yet we don't really know much about those organizations and how they might be tied into other forms of organized crime or even to government. So that's a second issue. And then with respect, of course, to Guyana in particular, I mean, Guyana is going through an incredible economic boom of sorts, but Guyana hasn't overcome, and Venezuela hasn't overcome, its claims to Guyanese territory. And of course, the Maduro government has made it a point often to mention that, that in fact the prosperity of Guyana may belong to Venezuela. So I can see how the Guyanese are worried. But Guyana also has now a large Venezuelan population, a Venezuelan influx. And so I think, overall, as Feliciano was mentioning, there in this discussion about foreign policy, we're always trapped here by these dimensions of local politics that cloud, I think, our ability to more effectively address the situation of thousands and millions of Venezuelans that are all over the place. At last count, I think there are 72 countries around the world that now have Venezuelan citizens.
Thanks for that, Dr. Gemara. And I'll add something since you brought it up. I think it's important to, to sort of expand on, and that is the proliferation of violent non-state groups inside of Venezuela that are also spilling over outside of Venezuela on the border. I've seen reports of, criminal groups harassing, people along the border, particularly, Guyanese, for example. And one of the concerns that I think is growing is whether or not the Maduro regime can maintain the degree of control over these violent non-state groups that they've done in the past. And so for me, a major concern is the greater independence or autonomy that these groups are going to find themselves in going forward in Venezuela, in which Maduro is now going to not just sort of have the internal domestic political pressure, but also be in violent conflict with the emergence of very influential, violent non-state actors that are gaining massive amounts of territory that are, oh, by the way, transnational in nature, whether they're operating across border towards, Guyana or Colombia. And so I think that is also a grave issue, sort of notwithstanding, some of the more general things that we see the Venezuelan government do to provoke, for example, provoke the Guyanese by flying into their airspace illegally. And so I think that there are, definitely some insecurities that we're seeing along the border that I think are worth mentioning. And as I was talking about the rise of violent non-state actors and the greater autonomy that they may achieve in the near future, creating or setting the stage for violent confrontation between the state that is already struggling and now the influential independence of criminal organizations. I saw Feliciano I think nodding his head, but I want to kind of drop that question out for, for anyone in the group. And Geoff, I know you worked with Insight Crime in the past, and you've done a lot in terms of looking at violent criminal non-state actors. And I'm sure Diana and Susannah, can speak from the ground as well. Anybody want to address maybe some of the concerns over how violent non-state actors may wedge themselves in the humanitarian crisis to try to build influence in the absence of the state's ability to address it, and what that might mean for future conflict in Venezuela when these groups gain autonomy and the regime is no longer able to control them. So it's a long, provocative question, but if anybody wants to tackle it, I'll call on whoever unmics first.
No, Mike,
right,
just one, Brian, because this is a much broader issue. But I'll tell you one that to us has become somewhat evident is that, unfortunately, and Diana spoke about the weakness of the state and how it's sort of fragmented and there's control on the ground of very different groups. It's not only non-state actors, Brian. We have seen how deliberately, police, local police, National Guard, and others are being sort of let on their own to make a living using their badges. So they can set up roadblocks, and it's on their own to decide how much they charge anyone they can let through or not. $5, $10, $50. And this goes to further types of criminal activities. Again, as I said, when we were raided and some of our members were arrested, and the ones who were here at our office, everything we had in our pharmacy was taken. It was 8,000 items of medicines. That costs a lot of money if they want to sell it through the black market. So this wasn't sort of a state policy. This was sort of, you do whatever you want and make money whatever way you want. And we have seen this happen to other groups in which when they arrest somebody, then they extort you, the organization or the family, to get them out of prison in a few hours. I mean, there's absolutely no charges, nothing happening unless you don't pay. So again, we're seeing, and this is why I'm saying this is much broader, but in this regard in particular, there's sort of a deliberate letting do, laissez-faire. You do whatever you can to make a living because the state will only pay you $5, $10, $15 a month. So you make a living, whichever way you can do with your badges as a state actor. Unfortunately, it's something that is happening. Thank you.
I think that's a great point. It lends to the fact that part of Maduro's survival has been predicated on its ability to create a passive environment for state institutions, leaders and institutions, to leverage their influence to find, their way into the illicit commercial environment. And we've seen that quite pronounced. My question is, or at least my concern rather, is what happens when the state tries to reassert itself, right? And it tries to you think of the Cartel de Solis, for example, as being a prominent group coming out of uniform that is managing so much of the illicit commercial activity, in the drug space. And there are lots of those groups popping up inside of Venezuela. And at some point, the state is going to try to exercise influence that it doesn't have over those groups. And again, I think that creates for a very volatile security situation on top of an already dire humanitarian crisis. And for American foreign policy, by the way, that's going to mean much more problems in terms of that degree of insecurity, not just with respect to humanitarian issues, but also violent criminal groups just 1,200 miles off of the sort of Florida border. And so again, I think there's a stage setting here that the humanitarian crisis is squarely in the center of, not just the health and welfare of the people, which I agree with Feliciano's comments earlier, it's first and foremost, but also the environment that crisis is leading to, in which it's creating opportunities for the expansion of criminal groups that can step in and fill some of that void from the government. And that conflict will likely take place in the future, at least I see it. Anybody else want to jump on that? So there are 3 questions in the Q&A, and I want to get to that. I definitely want to give anyone who had an interest in getting in on this conversation an opportunity. I don't see anyone unmiked, so I think that's my Oh, Geoff, there you go. I see you.
Yeah, no, just really quick. This issue of the lack of state presence in Venezuela, I think it's something that's not going to go away, even in the event of a transition. It's going to complicate any transition. I mean, this is something that the Colombia is dealing with years after signing its peace accord. So I think I just think it's important to sort of put it into that context, that this is something that it's going to require years of investment in areas that that haven't seen any significant state presence for quite some time. And just on the issue of the level of control exerted by local law enforcement. I mean, you see this. I was on the Venezuela-Colombia border in August, and went from San Antonio just to Merida, right on the border, up into the Andes, and had to pass through like over 24 different checkpoints. And at each one, you're accosted by an alphabet soup of security forces, and each one, trying to shake you down. So, I can only imagine what humanitarian organizations that need to access these areas have to deal with. So I think that what that underscores is the need for some kind of basic framework through which national humanitarian NGOs and UN agencies as well can have some kind of access to national level authorities, so they can have a direct line in case anything happens, as well as letters of safe passage that they can present at these checkpoints. I just think this is an issue that underscores the need for an emphasis on broadening humanitarian access.
Thanks, Geoff. So there, I think it's great insight, and I agree entirely. I want to jump over to some of the questions in the chat. There are 3 questions, and we have about 10 minutes to parse those questions. And so I'm going to toss them out, and I'm going to ask any of our speakers, Susannah, Diana, Feliciano, Geoff, Dr. Gamarra, if you want to tackle it. The first question has to do what seems to be with the political opposition. So the question is, the situation in Venezuela is unique, since it was largely due to political factors, as we've heard. Juan Guaido has lost quite a bit of international recognition, and the Venezuelan people have voiced their frustrations with the opposition party itself. The question this person has is it possible that the opposition party may fall through the cracks in this upcoming election? Anybody have any thoughts on that? And as a second part of that question, so I didn't see anybody on mic yet. As a second part of that question, one that was addressed to Geoff, what do you think the results of this Sunday's gubernatorial mayoral elections, what might the political landscape look like afterwards? And again, that's open to anyone that wants to address it, but they put Geoff in there specifically. So I feel the need to call you out on it, Geoff, but certainly open to anyone.
Well, I feel like I've been speaking a lot, but I think that any analysis of Sunday's elections needs to take into account not just what happens on election day, but also the fact that there have been massive irregularities in the lead up to the vote. That you've seen candidates who've been barred from running, that you've seen widespread use of public resources for campaigning by the ruling party. And of course, an unequal media environment in which opposition candidates are operating in unfavorable territory. So I think it's that's important to keep in mind ahead of Sunday. There's also the issue of the lack of a single opposition candidate. I think in nearly every state governor's race, there's multiple candidates who are challenging the ruling party, and of course that divides the opposition vote, and along with depressed turnout, that's not a recipe for success.
Thanks, Geoff. Anybody else want to jump on that question? If not, the next question has to do with the role of China and Russia in the Venezuelan crisis, and whether or not China and Russian engagement in Venezuela is or will shape U.S. foreign policy in Venezuela and the region. Anybody have any thoughts on that one? Dr. Gemara, do you want to take a shot at how the great power competition piece might play out with respect to its engagement in Venezuela?
Yes, very, very quickly. Look, it's again, I'm speculating, but the reality is, and I don't think I'm going to say anything that hasn't been said before, but to a certain extent, the situation in Venezuela, and to a certain extent, the let me just call it the vacuum in U.S. leadership has essentially led to a more strategic approach by both Russia and China with regard to Venezuela. So I think, you know, in some measure, one of the real challenges today is for the Biden administration to begin to look at Venezuela in perhaps the same way in which the Russians and the Chinese have been looking at that country. Venezuela should be part of our national security equation. It should be part of a focus that looks at the strategic importance of that country. Certainly, the Chinese and the Russians have, and I think it's important for us to put it in that context, without the pitfalls of falling into a squabble with the Republican Party, which again, we go back to what we said earlier related to the significance of domestic politics. But it seems to me that the great beneficiaries of our lack of leadership, going back several administrations now for Venezuela, has essentially positioned Russia and China very well for I would say, for the next generation or so.
Thanks, Dr. Gamarra. So we heard from Geoff, we heard from Dr. Gamarra. I want to ask if Feliciano or Susannah have anything else they want to add before we conclude. Feliciano, any thoughts on what Dr. Gamarra said, or anything else that we've addressed that's gone unsaid at this moment? And then Susannah, I'd love to give you the last word on anything that you think would be vital as we conclude for today.
No, thank you so much, Brian, and again for organizing this meeting this afternoon, and so well attended as well, and for all the reflections here. In regards to this last point by Professor Gamarra, I mean we're looking at this perhaps after the elections, in which it seems, at least according to some, that the opposition, because it is so diverse, you know, will not hold so many spaces of power, both in the regions and municipal elections, regional and municipal. And that again, there is more of sort of a consolidation of those spaces by the Maduro government, if that's this scenario. What we will see then perhaps is a government that will be somehow looking at itself in the mirror, you know, somehow with the political space for its own, and now facing its enormous deficiencies. And from this point of view, I mean, if one thinks again that this may present an opportunity, because there will be very serious difficulties, again, economic, and in running the state with these non-state actors involved in violence, controlling space, as well as state actors and so much, then, you know, it may be an opportunity for engagement among the actors in the international arena that could have a positive influence in regards to the internal situation. It would not, I think it would not be in the interest even of the Maduro government's partners to have this sort of disarray in regards to, you know, the handling of things inside Venezuela for their business, for their interest, but it will not be in their interest most likely. So again, it may be an opportunity, you know, with Turkey and one of the possibilities is promoting these spaces for negotiations. I mean, as complex as they are, but I agree with Professor Gamarra. I mean, one would have liked to, or one would like to see a different type of leadership from the U.S. What we saw in the past, 2 or 3 years, unfortunately, did not lead to let's say a constructive kind of engagement in regard to the situation. I'm not saying to one actor or another, in regard to the situation. So there is, again, perhaps an opportunity now. I mean, as the puzzle sort of becomes clearer, after these elections on Sunday, and it would be once again important if one thinks of what is necessary to prevent further deterioration for the conditions, the living conditions of Venezuelans here and in the region. Again, not an easy issue at all, and we're not experts in these topics, but anything that would not be thought of much more creatively, much more flexibly, politically, probably would not lead to good outcomes for the Venezuelan people. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Feliciano. Susannah, I want to give you the last word.
Sí, gracias. Yo en los últimos temas no he querido participar porque puedo emitir opiniones que no son precisas, ajustadas, no es mi tema. Sí, solamente sobre el avance de grupos irregulares en el territorio, me faltó comentar esa parte. Es algo que nos preocupa mucho por 3 cosas principales. La primera es que la operación de estos grupos definitivamente limitan el acceso del personal humanitario a las poblaciones que están bajo su área de influencia. Esto lo hemos visto en Apure, donde tenemos un programa humanitario grande. Hace unos meses hubo que suspenderlo. A lo largo de todo el arco minero, llegar a esas zonas se ha vuelto extraordinariamente inseguro por la operación de bandas allí. Pero lo que más nos preocupa es que no están tan lejanos y que tenemos incluso dentro de la propia Caracas zonas que de pronto entran bajo fuego y nos quedamos sin poder entrar 1 o 2 semanas allí, como es el caso de la Cota 905, como La Vega. Entonces, lo primero es que el avance de estos grupos nos va a limitar el acceso. Lo segundo es que el dinero que el Estado invierte en controlarlo, efectiva o inefectivamente, eso no lo sé decir, pero definitivamente es dinero que se desvía del gasto social y de las posibilidades de hacer algo por el bienestar de la gente. Lo tercero es que al no visibilizarlo, al no hacer esto visible, porque es un reflejo de la fragilidad, no se lo puede manejar con mano humanitaria. ¿A qué me refiero? A que por mucho tiempo, cuando ya en el conflicto colombiano se asumió la existencia de estos grupos, de la guerrilla, de los paramilitares, del ejército, habían acuerdos y por 2 o 3 semanas se desmilitarizaba, por ejemplo, un corredor del Caguán para que nosotros pudiéramos entrar a hacer citologías, a vacunar a los niños, a desparasitar, a dejar suplementos nutricionales. Entonces, mientras esto no se haga visible, corredores de este tipo en las zonas de Venezuela bajo la acción de estos grupos, va a ser muy difícil. Y ya para cerrar de manera general, yo por supuesto me sumo a los comentarios generales que suavizar las sanciones aliviaría mucho la situación, no solamente humanitaria de la población, sino las capacidades operativas que tenemos nosotros, las organizaciones, y nosotros como personas. Varios de nosotros tenemos las cuentas bloqueadas solamente por ser venezolanos y estamos buscando desesperadamente resolver estas situaciones. Entonces, eso por una parte, y por la otra, pues a volver a hacer un llamado a que necesitamos que suba de escala la cooperación internacional en Venezuela, que se desmonte un poco la idea de que sigue siendo una crisis como si fuera un terremoto, una crisis que comenzó en el 2008 o que 18 que acaba de comenzar. Es una crisis de progresión lenta que cursa y mata no por shock, sino por desgaste de medios de vida y por desgaste de las poblaciones, y por lo tanto estamos abiertas a que suba a escala la ayuda humanitaria al país, pero que esta sea una ayuda en la que se trabaje el nexo entre la asistencia de socorro y la asistencia por la vía de fortalecer la resiliencia de las poblaciones, en la que pasemos de estos proyectos de muy corto plazo, de 3 a 6 meses para salvar vidas, a proyectos multianuales orientados a fortalecer procesos de organización, a fortalecer los medios de vida familiar. Y el tercer mensaje claro y conciso y urgente que quiero pasar es que en Venezuela es posible hacer acción humanitaria. Lo hemos demostrado en los últimos 6 años. Es posible a través del tejido de organizaciones nacionales hacer una acción humanitaria efectiva, de primera línea, transparente y apegados a los principios humanitarios éticos, pero también técnicos. Lo podemos hacer, estamos aquí para eso y podemos rendir cuentas en todo momento de que eso lo podemos hacer bien. Así que si eso fuera un issue, un asunto de interés, pues despejarlo las veces que sea necesaria para decir que en Venezuela queda un buen músculo humanitario, es uno de los patrimonios del país para implementar esta ayuda y hacerla efectiva. Muchas gracias otra vez por la atención y el espacio, y esperamos que todo esto vaya cursando hacia un mejor escenario. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Susannah. Susannah, Feliciano, I know Diana had to drop off, but really grateful for the three of you joining us from Venezuela to have this talk. Of course, Geoff, Dr. Gamarra, always amazing to have an opportunity to share the Zoom with you as well. And so I want to thank all of our speakers. I definitely want to give a shout out to Camilo, Eddie, Dr. Cristina Rodriguez, and the team for helping arrange this and put this together. And of course, our interpreter, Lindsay, thank you so much for helping. And with that, this concludes today's session. I know we missed a few questions that were in the chat. We just ran out of time. But what that tells me is that we have to have a follow-on discussion at some point in the near future to continue the discussion around helping alleviate the crisis in Venezuela and sort of understanding policy options for that. And so until then, thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.